One of the wonderful things about the United States, though, is that you have a constitution that kind of makes it harder for bossy politicians and officials to do what they want.
Hey, everybody, and welcome back to the show. I've got a great guest with me here today, Douglas Carswell. He's the CEO at the Mississippi Public Policy Center, a former member of parliament, and the co-founder of Vote Leave. Thanks so much for coming on.
Hello, Brad. Lovely to be here.
Yeah, it's great to talk to you. I think you may be the first British guest that I've had on the show. And so I'm definitely interested in hearing the kind of unique perspective that you have as somebody from the UK who actually just moved to the US recently about everything. But I want to start with one thing that I just mentioned in your bio. You co-founded the Vote Leave. So you were big in this push behind Brexit. And I think that's interesting. Obviously, it is formally completed now. So at least in the US, our attention has moved on from it somewhat. But for the audience, what do you think the big takeaways are that Brexit taught us about how politics works and where people are at?
Well, I think Brexit tells us a number of things. First of all, I think it tells us that big change is possible. And I think those of us interested in shifting the Overton window, so to speak, in moving the dial in policy terms, I think we can look at Brexit as an example of how to do it. But I think we can also look at it as an example sometimes of how not to do it. You know, all of us in the business of free market conservative policy think tank worlds, you know, I think one of the key things we can learn from Brexit is that we need, first of all, to see ourselves the way others see us. So, you know, you might feel passionately, as I do, about, I don't know, school choice or a whole range of policy issues. I think if we're going to win the argument, we need to think in terms of how we're seen by those we're trying to win over. It took us Brexiteers in Britain a long time to figure this out. And we spent probably 20 or 30 years making mistakes and not asking ourselves honest questions about the popularity of our cause. But Brexit does ultimately show that if you're prepared to look at who it is you're trying to win over, if you're prepared to modify your arguments, and fundamentally, if you quit worrying about how people vote and focus instead on how they think, you can win pretty much any argument.
Yeah, that's an interesting point right there. And I think the UK is a fascinating example as a reference point for American politics, because in some ways, from my kind of, loosely informed perspective, I don't follow it super closely, but it feels like in some ways, the UK is far to the left of the average American politics. And in other ways, it's more conservative, or at least more culturally conservative. And so when you think of things like free speech and political correctness and kind of the stifling nature of cancel culture, I look at the UK and I see what could be, right, in a country that doesn't have a First Amendment, where really the woke activists are even in more power than they are here. And I'm pretty alarmed by it. But do you think that comparison is off base?
I mean, I think the UK, like America, has big government officials who want to boss us all around. That's clearly the case. That they're no different on our side of the Atlantic than they are in the United States. One of the wonderful things about the United States, though, is that you have a constitution that kind of makes it harder for bossy politicians and officials to do what they want. If you want to understand the UK, think of what America would be like if the whole of the United States was run directly by DC. If the boundaries of the District of Columbia were extended all the way across to the Pacific and all the way up to the borders of Maine and all the way down to Florida, and if the administrative state in DC had direct control, that would kind of be pretty much where the US would be. It would be rather like the UK. The UK doesn't have this constraining constitution. It didn't have the founding fathers to create a beautiful constitution to rein in that bossiness. Another thing that the UK has in common with the US is this sort of intersectional cult, if you like, this sort of dogma that's overwhelmed institutions of higher learning and the broadcasting institutions and big corporate HR departments. Now, I would suggest that actually that the intersectional cult emanated in the United States and it's kind of come across the Atlantic. It I think, has proliferated in universities on both sides of the Atlantic because both of them share a sort of similar cartel arrangement in higher education. You have academics who have tenure, you have universities where ultimately the universities are not really competing for money, and you have a prestige that determines student choices. So I think there's a lack of choice and competition in the higher education system, and without real choice and competition, bad ideas are able to proliferate. And unfortunately, we see this woke spasm that is afflicting the higher educational establishment institutions on both sides of the Atlantic. I think it's probably as bad in the UK as it is in the US. I mean, the US is obviously a much bigger country, so there are pockets of good learning that still exist. There are some pockets of good learning in universities in the UK, but I think it's a common affliction throughout the English-speaking world, throughout the West, in fact, this doctrine of intersectionism. I think perhaps one way of explaining it is in a sort of post-religious world, people are in effect trying to create a moral system to live by, and I think they're getting into trouble by trying to use woke intersectionalism as a moral code to live by. Your Twitter feed is no place to try to work out virtue and morality, and unfortunately, I think we're in this mess because we've embraced moral and cultural relativism, and it's not taking us to a very enlightened and happy place.
Yeah, and you mentioned the Constitution, which I really want to pick up on, because one of the big differences between the U.S. and the U.K. is the constraints and the safeguards that we have that make it harder to do things, right? Which can be frustrating if you vote for politicians and it seems like they can't get things done. But there's a reason for that, right? The system makes it difficult so people can't abuse power. They can't rush through in the heat of the moment with a democratic surge and limit people's rights. And so I guess then I want to compare and contrast how the UK handled the COVID pandemic, because I was alarmed here to see just how authoritarian and how drastic some of the measures were, and how persistent infringements on people's liberty were, in terms of people not being allowed to leave their homes in some cases, and putting healthy people on de facto house arrest. And the thing that the US had going for it, I think, is a bare minimum of constitutional constraints on how far they could go, and two, a diverse federalist system where states could try different approaches. So Texas and Florida and Georgia could cease their restrictions, and they're actually doing quite well. And places like New York and Michigan and California have fared rather poorly, but they're able to do that. But then I haven't followed it super closely, but from what I can see in the UK, it seems like even more dystopian and authoritarian and out of control.
Yeah. I mean, if you think things have been bad in certain US states, they've been a lot worse in the UK. I mean, here in Mississippi, for example, there was an attempt by a mayor in a town to prohibit drive-in religious church services. And fortunately, because the state of Mississippi has a constitution that prohibits that sort of behavior by politicians, the Mississippi Center for Public Policy was able to take that politician to court, and we were able to assert people's constitutional freedoms and get that ridiculous proposal overturned. Unfortunately, in the UK, where there's not a written constitution, it's much, much harder for people to, particularly at a time of crisis or perceived crisis, such as during COVID, it's much, much harder for people to use constitutional rights to prevent that sort of political tendency towards bossiness. So millions of people in the UK have found themselves under de facto house arrest. Some pretty absurd and nonsensical decisions to shut schools, despite the fact we know that actually young people are not particularly prone to COVID. Lots of bad decisions have been made. Lots of bossiness, some of it petty, but some of it actually quite monstrous, has been allowed to prevail without any meaningful check or constraint. Now, under the British system, people often say it's the House of Commons, the British Parliament, that is the safeguard, and that we needn't worry because the House of Commons will prevent the executive from overbearing behaviour. But how do you hold government to account when the House of Commons itself can't really meet and do its job effectively? It's a real problem. What I think COVID has shown is that the United States Constitution, for all its faults, has a better system of safeguarding individual liberty with its states' rights and its judicially mandated rights. In the UK, on the contrary, it's there are really no individual safeguards of liberty at a time like this at all. It's been extraordinary and appalling.
Yeah, and one thing that at least here in the US, we have different options in our political system, right? If you are an authoritarian and you want big government, progressive utopia, you can vote for Bernie Sanders. But if you want freedom, right, you can vote for Rand Paul, you can vote for conservative Republicans, not, some of the establishment ones who really love big government almost as much as Democrats. But there is at least some politicians and party that advocates for that. But obviously, I only have a loose understanding of this, but this happened, a lot of these restrictions on people's most basic freedoms, right? This petty authoritarianism in the UK happened under a conservative government, right? So is there even a strong political force, or at least within the Conservative Party, that actually stands for these things in modern UK politics?
No, there's not. I mean, in opposition, politicians in Britain, particularly on the centre-right, often like to talk as though they believe in small government and freedom. But one thing this COVID crisis has shown beyond doubt is that actually politicians on the right in Britain turn out to be as bossy and authoritarian as the rest. Never again must we rely on the preferences of politicians to be the guarantor of individual liberty. I think in Britain we clearly do need a Bill of Rights. We clearly do need a system to allow people to challenge the public administrative state. It's been quite alarming in Britain, because in Britain for many years we've had judges coming forward and declaring that they are the guarantors of so-called human rights law. And we've often been told that human rights legislation in Britain is a way of safeguarding individual freedoms and liberties. But actually, the single biggest infringement upon individual liberties in 30 or 40 years has taken place over the past 12 months in Britain. And I can't recall a single court ruling, a single judge, a single decision by the British Supreme Court that has safeguarded individual rights during this COVID crisis. So I think it's fair to say that the British Constitution is broken, and that it is not a good mechanism for safeguarding individual liberty. I hope that one of the things, before this crisis, people like you and me, Brad, would talk about freedom and liberty and individual rights. And I think a lot of people probably didn't really understand what it was that we were going on about. I think one of the consequences of putting people under house arrest for the better part of a year, one of the consequences of denying ordinary folk in their 20s, ordinary men and women in early adulthood, freedoms and opportunities that I think they should have had. I think one of the consequences of that is to popularize this notion that actually we do need fundamental change in Britain. We've left the European Union as a country. We can no longer blame Brussels and Europeans for maladministration and arbitrary, foolish government. We need to fix our broken constitution in Britain. And I think one of the countries we should be looking to is the United States. The American Constitution, drafted in that courthouse in Philadelphia 250 almost years ago, is a document that we could well learn from.
Yeah, and I want to talk about that too, because you recently moved to Mississippi and came to the United States to take over as CEO at the Mississippi Public Policy Center. And you are a former member of Parliament, right? You were super involved in UK politics, but it really seems like you've come to value and appreciate things about the American political system a lot more that aren't in the United Kingdom. So we've touched on a few. We've talked about the First Amendment and the court system. I mean, our Supreme Court, in stark contrast, I think just last week struck down religious restrictions in California that limited people's worship and unfairly discriminated against religion as opposed to similar gatherings of a secular sort. So beyond what we've already discussed, what elements of the American political system have you come to find as so valuable?
Well, I think the separation of powers is clearly the key to America's genius. This idea that you have different elected officials, different elected magistrates, rather like the system that existed under the Roman Republic. In fact, the founding fathers very deliberately emulated aspects of the Roman Republican system. It's why they built a Senate and a Capitol on the banks of the Potomac. The American system with its separation of powers is key. You need to have a separate legislative, executive, and judicial branch. In the UK, we don't, and I think we urgently and desperately need to think how we can change our system so that we have this separation of powers. The other great genius of the American system is the 10th Amendment. This idea that things that do not specifically belong to the federal authorities are the prerogative and the preserve of the states and of the individuals. This idea of having the dispersal of power amongst states is, I think, an incredibly important thing. People often talk about the American system as, the states as being the laboratories of democracy. You can have a particular approach to COVID in California, a particular approach to COVID in New York or Florida, and you can compare and contrast. But it's not just responses to COVID. Look at the way that Tennessee, for example, or Texas, for example, or Florida has innovated in terms of cutting taxes and the growth that they've generated as a consequence of that. Look at some of the great innovations in American public policy over the past 20 or 30 years. School choice, charter schools. These ideas didn't come from DC. These ideas came from the states. America is great because the founding fathers created a system that dispersed power and created competition and innovation. And 400 something years ago, there was a very famous sermon given by John Winthrop when he talked about the new American settlements. And he talked about them as being a city on a hill. By that, he meant that he hoped the new American settlements would be an example to the world, so that outsiders could look in and see an example of how a society might be organized. I feel that I'm an outsider looking into the American city on a hill. And I think America is that example to the whole world. What concerns me, and one of the reasons why I've come to America, is I'm concerned that there are many people living in the shining city on a hill who don't appreciate quite how remarkable and extraordinary and precious the United States is. It's precisely because of its constitutional arrangements and because of its founding ideals that America has not just been a great success, 13 ramshackle British colonies becoming the greatest republic the world has ever seen. America is the engine of human progress. America is this shining beacon that has illuminated the better part of humankind. And I think it's incredibly important that Americans appreciate what it is that America means to the world. I hope Americans will appreciate what America means to Americans. But boy, America, the world is a far better place today because of America than it would have been without.
Yeah, and that is an interesting point, that Americans are starting to lose sight of some of these values that have helped get us to where we are today. I think of this when you look at polls in terms of people losing support for free speech and open debate and supporting hate speech laws, or thinking not understanding the First Amendment. When you look at things like religious freedom and people's decreasing support for letting people live and let live. I think in some ways it is a rising left-wing phenomenon, right? You have people like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez who have come to power, right? An enormous cultural and political influence with huge bases of support, basically on the premise that America is bad, America is inherently evil, and I say that not to caricature them, but they believe that we're systemically racist. Slavery defines us. That we need to tear down all of our institutions, radically overhaul our economy and our system of government. And it seems to me that people like that don't have almost any appreciation for the things that you've identified.
Yeah. I mean, point number one, Brad, if America was a country based on hatred and racism, why is it that people from every color, every continent, every culture want to come here and make it their home? I've stood outside American embassies in capital cities around the world, and there's always a long line of people wanting to come into the US embassy to get a visa to come here. If you look at America's history, of course, America hasn't had a perfect history, but when slavery was ubiquitous in the southern part of the United States, it was ubiquitous around the world. The idea that America was uniquely evil because of slavery is simply wrong. There was slavery in many other states around the world. The idea that America should be ashamed of her past, I think, ignores the fact that over the past 120 years, the United States has been the world's great power. During that time, America has behaved pretty much like any other great power in human history. It has used its power as a force for good. Rather than colonizing the world, rather than establishing empires, which every other great power did, America insisted upon the end of empires. It insisted upon the British and the French and the other empires setting people free. The United States used its force as a superpower to intervene to defeat German militarism in the First World War, to defeat Nazism, real fascists in the Second World War, and to defeat the Soviet communists during the Cold War. And as a result of America's intervention, we have a world of interdependence and rising living standards and global prosperity. This is America's gift to the world. And anyone who stands on American soil and accuses America of being the bad guy, I would say is in complete ignorance of America's past, of America's history, and of moral truths. It's simply absurd to claim this. And I hope that this is just a phase. I hope that people who perhaps read a bit of progressive history at university are attracted to these politicians as a fad. I really think that the real truth is that the United States has been a force for good in the world. I'll give you another example. I grew up and was raised in a small country in Central Africa. My parents were doctors there for many years. And when I was growing up out there, it was very, very common for young infants to die of malaria at a very young age. Today, deaths from malaria in that country, Uganda, have fallen dramatically. And you know why they've fallen dramatically? Because of Bill Gates. Bill Gates, an American philanthropist, has poured millions into eradicating deaths from malaria. That is something that Americans should be proud of. I think it's extraordinary that a country produces not only a company that Bill Gates created, but a philanthropist that then uses that wealth to eliminate poverty and infant mortality in Africa.
They would say billionaires shouldn't exist, or as AOC's, I think one of her staffers said, every billionaire is a policy failure. But I want to ask about something a little different, which is that traditionally, at least in recent history, the American right, when you think of the Tea Party or conservative values, it was constitutional conservatism, limited government, free markets, First Amendment. But I do think you and I both work at free market think tanks. We're both plugged into the conservative right of center world. There's a rising tide in some conservative circles of people who basically have lost patience for the First Amendment. They feel that they're losing the culture war. I'm thinking of, the nationalist populists, the Josh Hawleys of the world. And they want to use the government to fight for the culture war and push their views of morality through the state onto others. And they think that they have little kind of patience for what they would call proceduralism, or nitpicking about, does this law violate the First Amendment? Or will this be used against us when the other side gets back in power? They say that's weak and we need to fight. So when you look at that section of today's right, what do you see?
I'm very alarmed by the state of conservative thought in the United States. When I was growing up, Ronald Reagan type conservatism was forward-looking, it was optimistic, and it was clear as to what its principles were. It believed in the ideas, to put it in summary, of Milton Friedman. If conservatism today simply morphs into being an angry protest movement, if it loses touch with its principles and founding philosophy, it's not going to get very far. It's not just not going to get very far, it's actually going to play into the hands, I think, of the extreme progressives. The extreme progressives want conservatism to be nothing more than an angry, reactionary shout against modernity. And when I listen to some conservatives, they're almost going along with that caricature. Conservatism should be a force on the side of individuals against powerful vested interests. It should be on the side of customers against big corporations, of citizens against the state. But it should never simply look to use the machinery of the state to take on its supposed enemies. And I think there's a really worrying trend amongst some in the conservative movement today who simply want to attack what they see as the other tribe, the other side. You know, if the conservatives in America want to flourish, they could start with something even more elementary. Ronald Reagan in 1966, I think it was, talked about the 11th commandment. And the 11th commandment, according to Ronald Reagan, was that conservatives shall not speak ill of fellow conservatives. And I think a lot of conservatives should start with that. Don't speak ill of fellow conservatives. Secondly, stop thinking about the Democrats. Stop obsessing about the Democrats. Start thinking, what is it that we need to do to offer tens of millions of ordinary Americans who voted for Biden 6 months ago or 4 months ago or whenever it was? What is it that we need to offer them that is an attractive, compelling proposition that will make them feel good about supporting conservatism? I'm not in the business of garnering votes. I'm not a Republican. I work for a 50C13 organization. But conservatism as an ideological movement needs to be in the business of garnering optimism and be a force for change. It mustn't just be a force for protest against Democrat politicians and progressives.
I think you just hit the nail on the head. It has to be more than just hating Democrats and hating the media and being anti. What is conservatism for? And I guess that's a good point for me to ask you a little bit about the work you're doing with the Mississippi Public Policy Center. What are your main issue areas and goals for Mississippi to promote that exact kind of message in your new state?
Well, we promote good policies and good ideas, and we work with politicians from across the aisle, and we focused on three key things at the moment. Number one is economic freedom. Mississippi is actually surprisingly restrictive in terms of economic freedom and autonomy. And I think this is reflected in the fact that Mississippi is often at the bottom of the performance tables. When you look at how Mississippi compares in terms of economic performance, in terms of educational outcomes, it often underperforms. And this is a reflection of quite how restrictive many of the rules and regulations and laws are in Mississippi. For example, if you want to be a hair braider, now you can tell from my hairline that I don't often use the services of a hair braider, but if one wanted to use the services of a hair braider, to be a hair braider needs to have trained for many, many hundreds of hours in order to be a licensed hair braider here in Mississippi. Cosmetology, these are areas of employment that are incredibly restricted. So some of the things we're trying to do is to remove these restrictions on so-called occupational licensing. We've got certificate of need laws which prevent the expansion of health services. One of the reasons why Mississippi has some of the worst health outcomes of anywhere in the country. So we're fighting these campaigns through the legislature and through the courts to try to get rid of this accumulated red tape and restriction that prevents Mississippians from earning a living and prevents the economy in Mississippi from growing. There's a second great area that we're really engaged in, and that is school choice. At the moment, you have a system in Mississippi where a lot of the public schools are run for the convenience of the people on the payroll, and you get very poor education outcomes. We want to see more choice and competition in the education sector. We're very inspired by what other states like West Virginia have done. And we think that actually it's only through choice and competition that we can give every Mississippian of every background the life chances and educational opportunities that they have a right as Americans to expect. And the third area is hearts and minds. We think that actually we need to make the moral case for freedom and liberty and the American founding ideals here in Mississippi. You know, when I was growing up, people like Milton Friedman made the arguments for free markets. And I don't think as conservatives we've done a really good job of making the case for free markets and for liberty. You're doing a great job. The Foundation for Economic Education is doing an absolutely inspirational job, literally an inspirational job. Because of the work that you guys are doing, that we're looking to do something similar here in Mississippi, so that we're producing content that actually resonates and connects with young Mississippians and shows them why it is that a free and a prosperous society is free and prosperous precisely because it maximizes individual liberty. We need to make this moral case for change, and that's something that we're very, very focused on doing at the moment.
Yeah, all of that is great to hear and great to see you involved in. People who are interested can check out the description for this episode, which will have links to Douglas's social media and to the center's website. But I know I have to let you go in a couple minutes, but we have to do the most important part of the show that everybody listens to the end just to get to. Douglas, what is your hot food take?
My hot food take is that actually grits are the best thing to have for breakfast. I visited America when I was in my 20s, and I loved grits. I haven't really had them since. And one of the things I love about being back in Mississippi is that I can have grits every day for breakfast.
What do you eat them with?
Quite often I just have them on their own, actually. There's one other thing I discovered for breakfast, but if I had it every day, you would need a wider camera to capture all of me because it's incredibly fattening food, but particularly down here in Mississippi. But one thing I discovered they have for breakfast that I really like is fried chicken on waffles with maple syrup. Now, about once a month, I allow myself that as a special Sunday morning treat. But, that is, and by the way, after you've had that for breakfast in these parts, you can also have a Coke with ice cream. I'm not sure what they call it, but they actually drink Coca-Cola with ice cream in it for breakfast. That's not something I'd recommend doing every day, but it's worth doing once in a while. They got some quite extraordinary food down here in Mississippi.
Yeah, I will say I'm a fan of the chicken waffles, not so much the grits, but I'm from the Northeast, not the South, so that might explain part of it. Douglas, it's been great having you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Brad. Really enjoyed this.